Ch.70, fallen golden statue, Boor Buries' suffering son. Call him over right this instant, Si Lian said. Feng Xin closed the index and middle fingers of his right hand together and pressed them against his temple, connecting with Mu King in the spiritual communication array. On the other side, Qi Rong clicked his tongue. So you came out of that remote place, Yong'an. Truly, barren lands produce unruly radicals. Think you can rob the gods just because you're poor? Then I won't rob, Lang Ying said. I will pay my respects and worship this god of yours right now. I will kneel and kowtow and beg him to give me money to save the lives of the people of my hometown, but will he do so? Qi Rong was momentarily stumped, thinking, if I said yes, this guy wouldn't actually run away with all the money like it's his right. Exclamation mark. Thus, he replied, His Highness the Crown Prince has become a god now, and gods are busy to death. Who has the time to mind you radicals? Hearing this, Lang Ying nodded slowly. I didn't think he'd care either. It's not like we never prayed nor begged, but it didn't work at all. Those who are meant to die will still die. Si Lian was shaken, and another cultivator shouted, You to be so disrespectful in the halls of God, aren't you afraid of heaven's condemnation? However, Lang Ying replied, It doesn't matter anymore. Condemn me if they must. I'm no longer afraid of not being saved, so why should I be afraid of being condemned? Qi Rong gave a wave and a number of guards waiting on the side rushed forward, surrounded that young man, and started beating him down. Feng Xin was still working to soften their attacks, and it only appeared like Lang Ying was being pulverized. However, he was in a dazed state, not avoiding or evading, and only occasionally raised his hands to protect the satchel on his back. On the side, Qi Rong grabbed a handful of melon seeds and munched, shaking his leg. Hit him. Hit him hard in the name of this prince. Truly, the very image of a mobster. Hearing him call his own title, Lang Ying shot his head up. You're a prince. Prince of what? Do you live in the palace? Can you meet the king? Qi Rong spat, I'm your granddaddy. You still think you can see the king, don't you? His Majesty's got a million things on his plate, he ain't got time for you. Lang Ying twisted his neck and demanded stubbornly, Why hasn't he got time for me? The gods don't have time for me, and neither does His Majesty. Then who has time to hear me? Just who should I go to? Does the king know just how many have died in Yong'an? Do the people of the royal capital know? If they knew, why would they rather throw money in the water than giving it to us? Qi Rong chuckled coldly, It's our money, we'll spend it as we will. Even if we use it like stones to skip it in the water, it's nobody's business, so why do we have to give it to you? What, you've more reason just because you're poor. Although that had logic in its own way, it was incredibly inappropriate for that time and place. Si Lian was about to find a way to seal Qi Rong's mouth when just then, a black-clad youth appeared in a hurry from just behind the pavilion. Your Highness sent for me. Si Lian waved him over. New King, come over here quick. In all the prayers you've received recently, have you heard anything about the drought in Yong'an? Mu King was also taken aback. No, I haven't heard anything.
Feng Xin blurted in the midst of his task. How could you not?
The refugees have already escaped here.
His tone was overly accusatory and Mu King stiffened.
He replied in a hard voice, I told the truth, there really wasn't anything. Are you trying to say that I'm purposely withholding information?
Well, did you
receive anything yourself? I'm on duty at the temple of the Crown Prince on odd months, and you're on duty on even months.
If there really were people from Yongan praying for the end of a drought, there's no
reason all the drought-related prayers were sent in on odd months, and you knew nothing. Feng Xin paused and realized that was certainly the case.
I didn't say you did it on purpose.
You think too much.
Seeming like they were ready to start quarreling again, Si Lian gestured a pause, hand signal in
annoyance. All right, Feng Xin didn't mean anything. Both of you stop this instant. The two immediately closed their mouths and stopped fighting.
At the same time, Qi Rong finally got tired
of watching his subordinates beat up Lang Ying, and grabbed for a small pouch to dump all the melon seed shells while saying, drag that robbing crook to the prison and lock him up. The guards acknowledged the command, yes sir. And a number of them picked up Lang Ying.
Let's deal with the problem at hand first, Si Lian said.
Save this man and I'll ask him about Yongan properly later. Mu King relaxed his expression, and asked cautiously, Your Highness, what do you plan to do?
You can't
just casually show yourself. After ascension, that was one of the rules Si Lian just couldn't understand. The heavenly officials said they needed to help the common people, yet they all put on airs and positioned themselves above mortals, barring themselves from appearing before the mortals at will, which often restricted him left, right and center, causing much frustration. Good thing Si Lian also had a number of ways to get around this. Without blinking, he raised his hand and pushed. The people standing just ahead noticed the shadows on
the ground shaking and turned around, confused. The next moment, Qi Rong yelled in horror, Cousin Crown Prince.
Si Lian had pushed his own divine statue over that sword, and flower-holding, kind and beautiful golden statue swayed back and forth, then slowly toppled to its side. Qi Rong looked as if he'd just seen his own mother kick out the stool after hanging herself, his heart bursting, and he lost all mind to care for Lang Ying as he rushed desperately to grab hold of the leg to that statue, stubbornly trying to keep it upright, screaming in fright. What are you useless trash all waiting for? Help me hold him up. Don't let cousin Crown Prince fall!
Exclamation mark.
He can't fall! Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. While he was terrified into distraction, Si Lian passed by him calmly and casually and stepped out of the hall. Feng Xin and Mu King's faces both dropped to the ground. It took a moment before Feng Xin finally cried, Your Highness.
That was your own divine
statue. Something like a fallen statue really was a bad omen, so it was something of a taboo. A heavenly official who'd push over his own statue just like that was unheard of, a rarity of the three realms. It's only a big chunk of gold, Si Lian said. If I didn't do this, their attention wouldn't shift otherwise. You two go and keep pushing down on that golden statue, don't give them a chance to leave. I'm going to meet with that man. Feng Xin and Mu King were still speechless and could only obey. They obediently stood next to that divine
statue, each using but a finger to press it down.
They only needed to use that bit of power and it was enough. The ones on the other side holding on had to use every ounce of their strength and still they could only keep the status quo, their teeth gritting.
This is indeed pure gold through and through, such weight. Lang Ying, who had fallen on his bottom, saw that those guards were no longer attending to him, stared at
the golden shine of that divine statue for a long while before he rose to his feet, dusted himself off, and ran away carrying his satchel.
Si Lian followed behind him.
He ran for quite a distance and entered a lush and heavy forest, then looked around before sitting down under a tree to rest. Si Lian hid behind that tree, easily cast a spell, and transformed into the form of a little white-clad cultivator. After changing, he looked himself over, making sure there was nothing amiss, and swung the whisk. He was just thinking how he should appear without alarm when he saw Lang Ying squat next to a puddle by
the tree, his head down and using his hands to dig at it.
That young man's hands were large, and one gouge was enough to create a wide and deep dent. Mud and dust flew as he dug, looking very much like a thin black feral dog. Si Lian was just wondering why he was suddenly digging holes when he saw him wipe off mud on his pants, scoop a handful of water with
both hands, and bring it to his lips.
Seeing this, Si Lian couldn't hide any more and rushed out.
He stopped his hand, took out a water bottle from his charmed sleeves, and passed it to him.
Lang Ying already had a mouthful of that puddle water, his cheeks round, and swallowed. He watched the
little cultivator who had appeared too suddenly, but didn't think it strange and didn't reject his offer.
He
took the water bottle to drink, gulping down the entire contents in one go. He only uttered after he finished, "Thanks."
Since he already abruptly appeared, Si Lian stopped caring for any natural opening. He tried his best to swing that whisk like a practiced immortal, someone trustworthy, and asked, "My friend, where did you
come from and where are you going?"
"We came from the Bay of Lang in the city of Yong'an. I was going to go to the royal palace, but I've
changed my mind.
I'm not going anymore." Si Lian was taken aback.
"We?" Lang Ying nodded. "We?"
"Me, and my son." Si Lian was growing even more confused, but his heart was dropping. He watched as Lang Ying removed
that satchel from his back and opened it.
"My son." Inside that satchel he was carrying on his back was the dead body of a small child. Exclamation mark.
Exclamation mark.
That infant was a tiny creature, looking no more than 2 or 3 years of age. His face was yellow, his
cheeks sallow, and his head had a few strands of thin and yellowing hairs stuck to it. There were even
rashes. That little face was twisted into a strange expression, as if crying, very much miserable. His eyes were already closed, but the mouth was open, nevertheless, no longer able to make a sound. Si Lian's pupils shrank, his spirit shocked to the core, unable to speak. No wonder he had felt this young man had a strange air about him. He couldn't describe what that strangeness was, but just that he was abnormal. The way he spoke, the way he behaved, it was like he didn't consider consequences at all, blunt and berserk without a care. But, by the looks of things, for what did he need to consider consequences? After showing him his son, Lang Ying wrapped his child anew, and carefully stringed up the fringes. Watching how focused he was in his action, Si Lian was miserable. It was his very first time seeing the dead body of such a young infant. He asked, stammering, how did your son die?
Lang Ying adjusted the satchel on his back and replied, bemused, how did he die? I don't know how he
died.
Thirsty, hungry, sick, maybe a bit of everything.
He scratched his head. When I first carried him out of Yongan, he would still cough a bit, and called, Dad. Dad. On my back. Gradually there were no more cries, only coughing.
And then there were no
more coughs. I thought he'd fallen asleep.
Later, when I found something to eat and wanted to wake him
up, he wouldn't wake up. That child had died on the road of escape. Lang Ying shook his head. I don't know how to take care of children. If my wife knew our son died, she'd yell at me to death. After a moment of silence, he added, I really wish my wife could still yell at me.
His expression had been calm the entire time, like a branch off a withered tree, a pool of dead water,
without a trace of life or ripples. Si Lian's throat tightened, unable to swallow. He said in a small voice, why don't you bury him?
Lang Ying nodded.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick a nice place.
Here's not bad.
There are trees to block the sun.
And water too.
We'll go back after burying him.
Thanks for your water. He coughed a few times and bent down again, continuing to dig with his hands. Si Lian mumbled softly, no, don't thank me, don't. Just then, Feng Xin and Mu King appeared, and were confused to see before them one digging a hole, and
the other watching in a daze.
Si Lian wasn't in the mood to speak, and repeatedly muttered a few jumbled words. It was some time before Si Lian remembered that just giving water wasn't enough. This man was returning to Yongan. Thus his hand went back into his sleeve and rummaged around, finally finding what he was looking for, and passed it to him. Here, take this. Lang Ying stopped and looked at what was in Si Lian's hand closely. It was a deep, red pearl no bigger than a nail, its luster smooth and sleek, polished and brilliant, and soul-stirringly beautiful. Even if he didn't know what it was, just one look and it was obvious this little gem was invaluable. This was indeed that one remaining red coral pearl earring Si Lian had worn during the Shangyuan heavenly ceremonial procession 3 years ago. That pearl left a rather deep impression on Mu King, so
the moment he saw it, his face changed.
Lang Ying didn't reject it, as if any proper manners and concerns of a normal person had left him, and he reached out his hand to receive it. Thanks. He carefully tucked the pearl in his belt, then he removed the satchel on his back, and gently laid it into the dug pit. Dad will come back soon to visit you. Finished, he used his hands and solemnly pushed the earth back to cover the satchel. Si Lian used a hand to support his forehead and closed his eyes.
A moment later, that young man left in a stride.
Feng Xin asked curiously, Your Highness, what did he bury here? He said, "Dad. He buried someone. New king was concerned with something else. Your Highness, I went and investigated earlier, and figured out what happened. Yongan has never been a wealthy place, their temples and shrines are few in number.
It seems they also have a local rule where those who don't offer donations can't pray, so those who visit
the temple of the Crown Prince have all been the wealthy, and the poor suffering from disasters can't
even enter."
Si Lian didn't respond to the report but said in a low voice, "You two, go to Yongan, and see what the situation is.
I will go meet the Guoshi, and ask exactly what's going on."
His face had never been this dark. The two subordinates didn't dare to be negligent and both acknowledged his command, departing an instant after. Si Lian himself thus turned and raced towards the direction of Mount Taikang. It appeared the disaster in Yongan could only be big and not small. But, even if he couldn't hear the voices of prayer, it didn't mean those at the royal palace had no clue at all.
Next chapter.
Ch.71, God of Heaven interferes in mortal matters. Mount Taikang, the Crown Prince summit. It was at the time of the day when visitors could no longer linger and were asked to leave the royal holy pavilion in droves.
Sounds of chanting sutras came in waves from within the Xianlei pavilion, and some
thousands of cultivators were conducting their evening rituals with the four Guoshi leading the service. Beneath the feet of that 5-meter-high golden divine statue, within the temple of the Crown Prince, on either side of the walls were innumerous everlasting lamps in rows that hung from the ground to the ceiling. Si Lian descended from the sky, lightly landing on the altar, and seated himself in position right before his own statue.
He waved a hand.
A light breeze blew from nowhere, and the countless lamps spun gently. With the swaying light, many of the cultivators looked up, voicing their awe, whispering among themselves. The Guoshi, who was composedly seated with his eyes closed, suddenly blinked them open and said,
"That'll be it for today.
You are all dismissed." The cultivators rose to their feet and left. The other 3 deputy Guoshi couldn't see Si Lian's form, but could also guess that something had descended, so they also departed the hall, closing the doors behind them. Once those tall doors were shut, Si Lian immediately spoke, unable to wait another second.
"Guoshi, did you know about the drought in Yongan?"
There's been no word from father. Did something happen at court? Or is it that he's unaware of what's happening? Heavenly officials were not allowed to secretly show themselves before mortals, but there were
exceptional cases, such as Guoshi, religious ministers, or such high-level cultivators.
Those who had cultivated to certain levels were representatives of heavenly officials in the mortal realm, thus, Si Lian
could speak directly to the Guoshi.
The no prostrating within the temple of the Crown Prince rule was
thus dictated through the mouth of the Guoshi from Si Lian. He had originally thought there were some exceptional circumstances that made the king unable to free himself to handle the disaster at Yongan, or that the king had no idea that the situation had worsened to the point of massive deaths. Unexpectedly, however, the Guoshi replied, "His Majesty the King is doing well, nothing major has happened, and he knows very well of what's happening in Yongan." Si Lian was taken aback. Then how come every time father has visited the royal holy pavilion, I've never heard him pray for Yongan once? Not even a word. Even if he didn't get along well with his father, he also knew that the king was not a fatuous leader. He
may have seen himself as high above others as the Son of God, and regarded hierarchy highly, but that
didn't mean he wouldn't care for refugees.
The Guoshi replied, "This has nothing to do with His Majesty.
It was I who advised that he nor the queen mention Yong'an in their prayers."
Why? Si Lian demanded. Because it's pointless, the Guoshi replied. Si Lian was shocked.
What do you mean by pointless?
A moment later his mind worked it out. Are you saying that, because I'm a martial god with no control over droughts, telling me would be
pointless? Did you forget that I may be a martial god, but I'm also the crown prince of Xianlei? My people are in trouble, how can I sit back and do nothing? After a pause, he continued, the most important thing right now is to save the disaster victims and take
care of them.
Please speak to my father on my behalf to stop constructing any more temples. There are already too many temples of the crown prince in this kingdom, I don't need them. And those golden statues, they could be melted down to help fundraise for the disaster. Yong'an sits in the west, and they need water. We can dig a canal, irrigate the waters from the east, water the crops and nourish the land. As he spoke, the Guoshi only shook his head, muttering, too early. Too early. Si Lian didn't understand. What's too early? Do you understand now why I said you shouldn't ascend too early? The Guoshi said. It's because your
people haven't died out completely yet.
Si Lian's eyes widened, and he shouted in outrage, Guoshi. What are you saying? What do you mean my people haven't died out completely yet? Exclamation mark. You've already become a god, but you can't forget who you were as a mortal, unable to let go and differentiate between the two realms, the Guoshi replied.
You're involving yourself, but you are also
powerless, and in the end it will only result in an utter mess. Si Lian was seated upon the altar and the Guoshi stood below, even though it was obvious Si Lian was the one looking down. When the Guoshi spoke, it was like he was the one above. How can I be powerless? As long as I act, there will be results. Every small bit counts, even if I could save but one, it's still better than not doing anything.
If you won't speak for me to my father, then I will go.
Seek him out myself, Si Lian said. Si Lian jumped to his feet, but the Guoshi grabbed at the corner of his sleeve, yelling, Come back! Do you know why heavenly officials can't show themselves before mortals at will?
There's
a reason behind that. Thousands of years of rule, don't do anything foolish.
Si Lian whipped his head around. Then what can I do?
I can't do this, I can't do that. Guoshi, there are people dying right now in my land. Aren't gods called gods? Because they can save the people. If I don't appear now, then when can I appear? What would be the meaning of my ascension then? Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. The Guoshi held him down, sighing.
Your Highness, sigh, Your Highness.
Do you know what I've seen? Si Lian huffed and forced himself to calm down before sitting again.
Please enlighten me.
The Guoshi stared at him. I've seen your future, and it's pitch black. Si Lian looked him straight in the eyes and said, "You must have seen wrong. I only like to wear white. I worry that, not only will you be unable to save your people, they will turn around and drag you down." From the divine altar, the Guoshi said, "My people aren't like that, they can clearly recognize what's right and wrong.
If I can't save them, then
there'd be no meaning to me being on this altar anyway," Si Lian replied. A moment later, the Guoshi sighed.
What your father has done can't be said to be right, but it can't be
said to be wrong either. You said to fundraise, but it's not like your father hasn't tried, and you can go see how that ended. You said to dig a canal to irrigate the waters, then go see that river for yourself as to whether it could be done.
Si Lian nodded his head. I understand. Thank you, Guoshi.
Upon leaving Mount Taikang, he headed westward and arrived at the city of Yonggan of the Kingdom of Xianlei. In the 20 years of his life, Si Lian had never thought the sun to be so scorchingly deadly. The first step he made upon that earth, he could already feel how wretchedly hot and dry it was, like everything in the air had been contorted. With the blazing sun above, the land had already cracked into broken chunks of earth, horrifyingly aged.
There was a deep gutter that seemed to have been a river once, but it was
already dried up to the bottom, and the blackened riverbed was emitting a strange stench. He walked for a long time and didn't see a single field. Maybe there were fields once, but they were unrecognizable at this point. Si Lian looked around as he walked, that dry and hot breeze blowing his long hair into a mess, but he was too occupied to mind it. Just then, someone suddenly called for him from behind. Your Highness. Si Lian turned his head and saw two silhouettes in black approaching in a rush.
It was Feng Xin and Mu
King.
Si Lian cut straight to the heart of the subject. Any news?
Feng Xin flapped the front of his shirt to fan himself.
Yes.
In the past 2 years, the whole Western territory has experienced a water shortage, and it finally erupted this year. Yonggan is the worst affected. The rivers dried and the rain doesn't fall, so the crops won't grow. The wealthier families are still faring
all right, as long as there's money, then food and water can be bought from elsewhere.
However, most of the wealthy have already moved to the eastern territories. Those who are left are either poor or handicapped. Si Lian knitted his brows. The Guoshi said my father didn't just sit back and also gave command for send disaster relief, so why is it still so serious? Mu King said coldly, when funds go through government checkpoints, each checkpoint will skim off an amount, until finally there's nothing left. Of course it's still this serious. If it were up to me, it would have been better not to have sent anything, rather than feed those parasites. Si Lian held his breath, forcing his anger down. I will tell those parasites to throw every single cent
they've eaten back up.
However, Mu King reminded him, Your Highness, did you forget?
This is not within your control. Heavenly officials can't interfere in mortal matters.
3 meters of ice weren't formed by 1 day of
cold. His Majesty the King is the one responsible for the mortal realm. This is his duty, and he still couldn't
deal with it. You've got your hands full of countless prayers from your devotees, so how can you handle that too? Mind this, mind that, in the end you'll only bring trouble onto yourself. Besides, that only cures the symptoms, not the root cause. Feng Xin blocked out the sun with his hand. To cure the root cause, there still needs to be water. How about your highness asked the Guoshi to tell his majesty to irrigate the waters from the east to the west for now. Si Lian shook his head. I suggested that to the Guoshi already. What did the Guoshi say? Feng Xin asked. Si Lian swallowed.
More or less that it's not feasible.
But now I've realized it really can't be done.
To irrigate we'll need to bore the river.
However, something like boring for a canal requires mass conscription, who knows how many years that'd take, and it'd only exhaust the people and the treasury. It won't do. Feng Xin nodded.
True enough.
Distant waters can't put out nearby fires. Si Lian hummed. But, if this can't be solved by mortal means, maybe we can try divine methods. I heard
the Rain Master has changed in recent years.
The new ascended Rain Master seems to be a reclusive person, but I'll see if I can pay a visit and request for moving waters in the east westward in the form of rain. Ever since Si Lian ascended, other than greeting Jun Wu, he had never personally paid any visits to any
other heavenly officials, and never tried to purposely befriend anyone, treating all as equals within the
spiritual communication array. Him taking the initiative to pay visits was thus a rare occasion. Mu King, however, objected. No. Si Lian turned his head.
Why not?
Your Highness, I've investigated thoroughly.
In truth, these past 2 years, it's not just Yongan or the Western territories that were experiencing a shortage of water, but the entire kingdom of Xianlei.
Only, the Eastern territories are close to the sea and have surrounding lakes and ravines, so it's not as obvious, and hasn't become an issue yet.
But overall, the amount of water and rain have significantly decreased compared to before.
Si Lian's eyes widened as Mu King continued. If we really dug a canal or used rain to move waters from the east to the west, then it may temporarily relieve Yongan, but it won't save it completely. It would only be helping them hang on by a thread. At the same time, the eastern territories could very well fall into disaster. Si Lian's heart squeezed. And most of the population of Xianlei, along with the busiest places, are all in the east, more than 3 times the size of the west, especially the royal capital. If drought was to happen there, Feng Xin immediately understood too. The consequences would be way more serious than Yongan. A greater number would die. Mu King nodded, his expression solemn. There'd be a much bigger riot born from it. Si Lian took a deep breath. So, is that what Guoshi meant when he said what father did wasn't right but wasn't wrong either? Only that he made a choice. So, Your Highness, that no one went to your temple to pray was a good thing, Mu King said.
Leave it to
His Majesty to decide what to do. Si Lian didn't respond and turned around.
The entire time they walked, everyone he saw was nothing but skin and bones. Men and children had their
upper bodies bare, rows of ribs visible and clear on their torsos, and the women bore dead eyes, their
faces bereft of life.
No one wanted to move, they didn't have the energy to move, and everything emitted The disgusting stench of death, making one want to scream and escape this decaying earth and return to the glory of the bustling royal capital. It was a long time before he finally said, "You two stay here and assist me, deliver as much water as you can. Let me think on this." "Fine. Go and think carefully," Feng Xin said. "Just let me know what to do once you've decided." Si Lian patted his shoulder, then turned to leave.
Behind him, Mu King said quietly, "Your Highness, do think about this carefully.
We can help 10 days, maybe 20, but not 1 or 2 years.
We can save 100 lives but not 100,000. You're a martial god, after all, not the god of water.
Even if you were the god of water, you can't create water from nothing. If we can't fix the root of this problem, we can't keep going like this. This is merely an inadequate measure, like using a cup of water to douse a burning cart of firewood."